Yeah. So my takeaway from Werner is that we can remain bullish, right? We can order a bit more stock, and we can charge the farmer a little bit more. So Wandile, we're looking forward to your presentation again, just focusing on what's on the agenda for government at the moment. I think the master plan, there was quite a debate I think earlier this week around that as well, so we keen to get your insights on that. Werner is not part of our marketing team. But clearly good support of us. Thank you. Let's start.
Good morning, colleagues. We're just setting up the screen. My name, as Jack has said, my name is Wandile Sihlobo. I work for the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa, AgBiz. Actually, one of my bosses is here. Of course, he sits at the board of AgBiz, so it's good. I'm in safe hands. If I miss any of the things that he thinks are important, he will be able to jump in and put me in correct of that. And also on the AgBiz side, we're really grateful that to have Case as one of our members, and also just the opportunity today to make a couple of words. I will be speaking about a couple of things to touch about what is on the government's agenda to an extent, but also I thought it's appropriate to start with the macroeconomic background to build on a solid foundation that Werner just laid down now about the agricultural sector, particularly the grain industry. But I am a bit pessimistic about where we are at this point in South Africa. And if I were to summarize about what the environment that we are looking forward to is going to be, I think the next 2 years is going to be extremely difficult. We are in an environment of rising input costs across the board. The cost of capital is going to be rising. This afternoon, for example, the South African Monetary Policy Committee is sitting down, and everybody is looking at a quite steep increase in the repo rate, which is currently around about 4.25 at the moment. Everyone is looking at a 50 basis point or so increase this afternoon. And all of the other factors on the farming input cost is the one that Werner has already alluded to. If you look at the grains, if you look at the input fertilizers, fuel, and all of those things. And I think for South Africa, the other challenge, which is, I think, is a challenge of everyone across the world, when we emerged from COVID-19 in year 2021, we thought that the economies will be rebounding across the world. There was a lot of money that the Americans pop into supporting households in Europe, in the UK, and the immediate withdrawal of that fiscal support to the household, as well as the rise in commodity prices in general, that has fueled inflations to levels that we haven't seen over the past 3 decades or so in many countries. And I think the addition then of what we have seen in the Black Sea, which Werner so brilliantly worked on, it also added to that tough macroeconomic foundation across the world. And I think the only thing you can take from that chart is that if you look at the estimates from the IMF from April, the purple line, and looking across into 2023, there's a slowdown across the world. And I think for South Africa, because we already had some of our challenges that we're having, either it's a load shedding, poor road networks, failures in a couple of SOEs, all of that is compounding, and we are actually in this environment which we've circled, where we see growth for the next 3 years or so in South Africa being at around about sub 2%. And there are big consequences on that, both socially and I think for a number of businesses, even outside of the agricultural sector. If you look at that point about inflation that I was talking about, and that is also going to be leading to that slow growth. South Africa has been in a period where you saw the South African rand remaining slightly solid around about 15 rand to the dollar for quite some time, even in the midst of many headwinds over the past few months. But we see that capital leaving South Africa a lot. Part of the story is because a number of those developed economies, the UK, the US, and everybody else, is beginning to increase their interest rates. And the only thing you can take out of this chart is that over the long run, inflation in the developed countries were rightly in this dotted line. Right now, where inflation across the world is at is on those bars that I've highlighted there. The US, for example, nearly 40-year high. And in South Africa, we're still at least at a really comfortable levels, as you see us there around about 5.7. If you look at yesterday's figures, we're around about 5.6 on inflation. But the bottom point is that the interest rates are increasing, and there will be a slide of capital flight out of South Africa going to the developed world. And that has consequences on that slow growth story that I was talking about in the past couple of slides. And I think then there are also social consequences which go beyond the agricultural sector. Because we are a country that is not expecting to grow over 2% for the next 2 years. And that's what we see up until 2024 there. And that means then even the opportunities to create employment beyond agriculture but broadly in the country are actually going to remain slightly bleak. If you take the past 2 years where we had the heavy COVID-19 lockdown and the impact in South Africa, we saw nearly 1.4 million South Africans losing employment. When we look back at that data, both informal and the formal sector, to try to estimate about when will those people be back in full employment in South Africa, we see that 1.4 million people coming back to full employment around about 2025. And if you look at those people and then you look at the young people that are also getting out of school, either graduating or some dropping out or whatever the circumstances are, they are adding on that bulge of the people that are actually out of employment. And that presents then a number of socio-economic challenges across the country. And I think many of you are seeing those unrests. Either some are demanding higher wages and causing a lot of disruption in the mining industry, in the agricultural sector, or even in communities, some of the vigilante groupings that we are seeing across South Africa. And I think that's the big issue, and that's what is currently worrying the politicians at this moment, is to say how do they change that, especially as they are closer to 2024, which is where they are looking at the elections. And that's really the macro theme that we are all worried about, to say how do you begin to change about that. But I think the positive of that is that we all know what are the key challenges and what interventions South Africa should be thinking about. I've already alluded to challenges in our network industries, the need to boost investor confidence in the country, and also just to deal with high levels of crime, either organized crime that is vandalizing our logistics industry, the railway line, the ports and everything, or even crime that is in the households. And some of the interventions that are really needed, which at AgBiz we see that they can actually begin to change, is a heavy investment in the network industries and also dealing with the issues around the rule of law. We think those will begin to actually just change the sentiment in South Africa, and that begins to be an investment-friendlier environment. Of course, the ANC and the others, they are releasing their policy document, for example, in my understanding, sometime tomorrow, that will officially be finally out. And if you begin to read in some of the insights that are coming out of them, it's a quite different read compared to what we have had from the Economic Transformation Committee over the past couple of years. It reflects on the problems, deeply into those. The network industries, they are well acknowledged. Our water infrastructure deterioration, our railway industry, our ports, our roads, all of that is beginning to be acknowledged onto that. The energy constraints are well acknowledged, and there are views about what must be done about all of those things. And of course, if you look at the macroeconomic front, where in the past there were all of these issues around saying nationalize the Reserve Bank, the Treasury should do all sorts of support system, either basic income grants and all of those things. There's a stern warning there about the rising cost of debt, in the fact that the Treasury needs to actually make sure that there is some bit of a fiscal discipline. And all of those things are good. They are tough in the near term, but they are good in helping us to change that bleak picture that I showed at the start of South Africa looking bad. So on paper, there are good things. But of course, the other fundamental problem in South Africa is the functioning of the municipalities that are not fully delivering to what is needed. And I think for the agricultural sector, that's one of the major areas. There's a number of examples. People can think of clover in KZN and in a number of areas where the failure of the municipalities have had huge consequences. And if you read that document, as you will have a sense of it sometime tomorrow, you will see that it also begins to look at the South African economy from a sectorial perspective. There's a deep dive on energy, there's a deep dive on mining, there's a deep dive in agriculture, and in all of the other sectors of the economy. Within the agricultural sector, which is where from an AgBiz side we're heavily involved in helping to shape some of those views that are coming out of there. The talk around expropriation without compensation, for example, is something that has come off the table on those policy documents. But what is beginning to emerge more strongly now is, say, when we think about land reform, let's think about the Land Reform Agency. That Land Reform Agency is basically responsible for the redistribution part of land reform, because we have a land reform program that has 3 pillars: restitution, tenure, as well as redistribution. And the redistribution angle is also even good because there is already some supply of land that is sitting on a state land, just over 2 million hectares that is sitting there for agriculture. But in totality, there's roughly about 9 million hectares that is on the state land. So it begins then to say, how do you take those assets and deal with them? Within the ANC document, it begins to talk about the title deeds that are needed to be transferred to the black farmers. Those things are not going to be, of course, as effective because on paper, yes, they look good, but in practice, you are still dealing with the same stuff that has been applying land reform for the past 3 decades in a certain way. So changing and applying these new principles is going to take some time, but I think the good positive out of it, it begins to take away uncertainty that has been in the agricultural sector for quite some time. And that's the core message. I think it's also a benefit that will be coming out of that work when you see it. The other important point which Jack was speaking about earlier is the story around the master plan, which was launched last week. The master plan on its own also is not perfect. Labour, for example, did not sign it because they needed some concession that they needed to be made there. They wanted to make sure that farmers provide health insurance for workers and all kinds of things that should be provided, which the agricultural sector could not actually do that. And I think that for agriculture, if anyone knows the structure of farming in South Africa, the people that actually make a lot of money, not a lot of money per se, but a significant proportion of money, they actually relatively small proportion. About 46% or so of the 42,000 farmers. The 42,000 farmers and farming units in South Africa that are registered are the ones that are having a turnover of 500,000 rands a year. About 56% of those, they are just making up around about 2 million rands, the turnover. So they could not afford some of the things that the labor constituents, for example, was asking for. So there was that pushback. That master plan is also not satisfactory to agribusinesses. We had things at AgBiz that we needed. It's not satisfactory to government. Government pushed and wanted some things. But the bottom point that I think was the core of it is that bad is better. Because at the end of the day, without a master plan, you are stuck at the same position that you are in. But if that master plan begins to introduce some new pathways that can be done to push us forward, it's actually a better position than where we are. What does the master plan do? The master plan basically goes deeper into the subsectors that Werner was talking about, but also horticulture and the others, and begin to identify what are the key constraints to growth into that. And then begins to say, how does business and private sector, how does private sector business and government and labor work together in addressing those? Either they are on the network industries, or they have to do with governance, or they have to do with legislative work, or in the livestock industry, for example, now where they are having Act 36 issues and tough conditions on registering certain chemicals, and also dealing with the FMD. So it actually begins to deal with all of those pathways of interventions. Even there, that master plan looks relatively, it's not satisfactory on paper, but it looks good, better, and we have accepted it on the AgBiz side, and Kus gave us a mandate and the other members to sign in onto that. But I think the implementation of it will need some of you that are sitting here in the room, case for example on the private sector side, where there are pathways to participate on that, they will be required to do so upon, of course, if it makes business sense for them. But on our side of AgBiz, we would like to encourage everyone who can, if it makes business sense, to participate on that, because the key goal of the master plan is inclusive growth and job creation, so that we don't hang onto that problem that I highlighted at the start. But of course, all of that within the business parameters of each and every entity. That's where they will be making those decisions. But the core challenge of the master plan is that it's designed in Pretoria. We talk about in Pretoria, but it will have to be implemented in small towns and the municipalities and the provincial department, and all of those needs to be stretched to be able to collaborate with the agribusinesses. And I think that's where on phase 2 of implementation, which will be starting in the next few months, the challenge will pretty much start to be. But I think that master plan and those ANC policy documents, the core thing that they are acknowledging is that agriculture is more important if we are dealing with issues of poverty. Because if you were to ask any South African about what are the 3 top challenges that we face as a nation collectively, we are facing issues of rising poverty, we are facing issues of slow growth, economic growth, and we are facing issues of high inequality. If you look at agriculture, there's enough evidence, academic evidence, that shows that growth in agriculture is 2 or 3 times effective in reducing poverty than growth in any other sector of the economy. And this is some of the key points that the policymakers, even the president, begins to acknowledge, which is why there is this intense focus in agriculture. But I know it has all been a talk, but the core thing now is to say they want to see something being done in action. But the principles that are actually the guys have internalized are basically these, as well as the fact that there is prospects for employment. You all remember Professor Mohamed Karan and his promise of saying we could see 1 million jobs in agriculture. And I think that prospect remains in agriculture and agro-processing, that we could see a lot of employment, and the master plan bakes in some of those interventions that needs to be made. And I think at the core, it reflects to some of our challenges, because from an AgBiz perspective, these are the top challenges in South Africa's agriculture. We see challenges on the inefficiencies of administration on the state side. That includes all things around biosecurity, crop science, F-36, inefficiencies and stuff in various municipalities. We see a major challenge in infrastructure. We are a country that is export orientated. Out of what South Africa produces, we export about 51% of that in value terms. Last year, that was about $12.4 billion, a record level. And it was also record even in volumes perspective. And if our ports and our logistics and our roads networks are not into scratch, that's one of the bigger challenges that we do see from an AgBiz perspective. Of course, security is one of the major issues. Stock theft, farm attacks, and all of those things, and also vandalization of the infrastructure. Organized crime is one of the key issues that we are beginning to see. The uncertainty part around land reform is the one that I was saying, that land reform agency will begin to address that. And just quickly clarify that that land reform agency is not a sub-government issue, but it's actually going to be run on the private sector as well as the government people that will sit on the board. It's almost, when you think about it, think of a sand park as well as the Department of Environmental Affairs, whereby they run that entity independently, even though the policy guidelines will be coming out of the Department of Environment. So the policy guidelines will come out of Department of Agriculture, but it's going to be an entity that will be run independently so that it can be effective, and it will bring in people with skill who can actually be able to do that. And it will be launched formally before next month, because it has to be done all over the first half of this year. That's what the Minister of Agriculture will be launching on that. Of course, the issue of widening our export markets. Werner spoke a lot about on the grain industry, but if you look at our fruit sector, we see major growth in that side, particularly of what has already been planted in the horticulture space, deciduous fruits, going into 2030, for example, our citrus industry, what we hear from our members of CGA is that they will increase by roughly about 50% or so from where they are today, and all of that needs effective ports, but also new markets, which is why we're beginning to talk with the likes of China, Saudi Arabia, Bangladesh, and the others in widening that market access. And of course, Verna, you spoke a lot about the geopolitics, which are a major challenge for South Africa. And I think the points you were making about fertilizer are key, because we are a country that is importing about 80% of our annual fertilizer consumption. But I think in all of those things that we are talking about, South Africa's agriculture has been doing exceptionally well. In value terms and in volume terms, this sector has more than doubled compared to where it was in 1994. Just in a period between 2010 and 2020, if we were to look at how much this sector has grown, you begin to see numbers like this. Yes, some people might not have actually feel this growth in their pockets because the input costs also have been rising. But if you look at what has been happening, this has been doing well. And there are core two things that have been behind this. It's technology, both mechanical, which is what CASE supplies, as well as biological technology, which is what other colleagues, Bayer, Syngenta, and the others supply. And also the fact that export markets have been widening. And now we are beginning to get that external demand that we are getting. And that has given us this growth that we have been able to enjoy as a country. And I think there's prospects to actually widen that. But in the near term, though, the numbers are going to look negative this year. And I think, though, this should not be seen as if the sector is doing badly. Werner showed a great number where he was saying the yields look lower this year, but if you were to look at it, comparing the past few years, it was still the third, if not the fourth yield, which means then it's the same story that here you will probably see this contraction of about between 3 and 5% contraction in agricultural gross value added. But if you were to look really on the output that is going to come out this year, you compared with the past few years, we will still be doing fairly well. To an extent that at AgBiz, we don't see a decline in employment in agriculture. We see stable employment at over 850,000 people this year, regardless of what we will be seeing on that side of the contraction in the growth value added of this sector. And that contraction is actually going to be caused by this area that we are in, that wet conditions, those wet rainfalls that we actually saw for much of the year, particularly in these regions, are what will be causing that slight decline that we see in the gross value added. But this is a shortening of the values that Werner has already shared to say this is our estimates for grains, maize, sunflower, soybeans. But if you compare all of this with the past couple of years, we're still sitting at very relatively comfortable levels. And we have great supplies in the fruit industry, great supplies in the vegetable industry, and of course it's our livestock industry that is currently under extreme pressure. And if you look at why there is that contraction just because of what had happened in the grain industry, this table, for example, shows you what makes up 75% of South Africa's gross value added. When we talk about agricultural growth, what makes up 75% of it is these subsectors. And maize industry that is slightly declining, it still features highly there. The milk industry is slightly affected by what has happened in Natal recently, all of the extreme floods. The egg industry also slightly affected by that, and we have a bad FMD disease right now in the livestock industry at the moment. It's actually at a record high where we have over 6 provinces having it outbreaks, and that is also negatively affecting our livestock industry. Hence you see those figures that I've just showed to say the sector could contract somewhat, but overall we're still thinking about long term the sector is sitting stable. Just to make a quick point on the points that Werner has already made. I mean, globally, you all see there, and I think the story of Ukraine, Russia pushing up commodity prices, it adds on already tough conditions because China was already buying grain. There was already a drought in South America. There was already a drought in parts of Indonesia, and all of that for March of 2021. It already supported the prices, and now we are even at these levels. And with the new ban of exports of India and Indonesia, that slight dip that we saw there in the vegetable oil is going to start to make a bit uptick again on the 3rd of June when these updates of the global FAO food price index are being released. And I think the core point here that I wanted to make is that the livestock industry is facing extremely tough time. It has an FMD disease, and they also have to be paying some of these prices that are going to continue or remain at those high levels. But if you are in the grain industry, perhaps you will be doing relatively well. The consumer is also one of the major issues in South Africa. Food price inflation, you saw yesterday, is still at around about 6.3%, came off from 6.6%. But the positive thing here that I wanted to emphasize, particularly Werner spoke about the story of the Russian grain robbery of the 1960s. In South Africa, while there are worries of food price inflation, there is not going to be intervention to stop exports or anything. The key thing that is going to give market a signal is really making sure that there's a continuous publication of SAGES information, there's a monitoring of commodity prices, but there's not going to be an intervention in these markets. Even the Competition Commission, with its inquiry in the fresh produce market, they are actually not doing an inquiry, but rather doing just a broad study of understanding that. And they've actually asked AgBiz to assist in the advisory part of that particular study. So we have a sense of what is going to be happening. There's not going to be intervention in these markets. But I think the major thing that adds to that cost story, you've already spoken about this, Werner, about the significance of Russia in the fertilizer market. But I think the point I could add to what we have already made is the fact that the likes of China, Canada, and the US, they do have some minerals that they need from Russia for actually completing their fertilizer output. And I think that is what is going to be an issue. And the fact that China, for some time, since July last year, has already stopped the exports of fertilizer. And this is the major issue as we head towards the end of the year, which I guess, Jack, it adds to that point I was saying. It's going to be a tough situation of higher input costs in agriculture. And this is what we see, and I think this is going to continue for quite some time. Because the major story was this: if China can begin to take off that ban on the exports of the fertilizer exports, and I think that could somewhat soften the blow that we are seeing from the Black Sea. Because China makes up about 12% of global fertilizer exports, and Russia is about 14%. So you have all of that out of the market for some time. And I think that's the major issue that we are all worried about at this point. But as I conclude, in South Africa, it's a great space to be in. There's still a lot of expansion over the next couple of years. These headwinds that I've just highlighted are going to make life difficult for 2023. But looking at 2024 and forward, there's a room for expansion in all of these areas of South Africa, which are high-value land. For example, Eastern Cape, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, all hold room for expansion. Some of that is in the communal land, but the talk of title deeds that the politicians are beginning to talk about, no matter how slow that process is, it adds new lands that can come into production and boost agricultural sector to these areas. And these green areas are high potential lands, and all of them, they lie here where that roughly over 2 million hectares is lying on that can be brought into food production. And I think the only thing that is missing there is agricultural infrastructure. The silos, railway line, feed mills, and all of those things. Because all you read from this map is that where there are dots, that's where much of South Africa's agricultural infrastructure is lying. Where there's empty places like these areas, there is no infrastructure. You can see it as a constraint, or you can see it as an opportunity. Of course, these are areas to invest in. As you retire, you can look at those areas with these. So, and I think the core thing that collectively as a country now, and I think we have to, and the AgBiz, we are trying to get away from this point, because we can blame and say government is not doing anything about X, Y, Z. But at the end of the day, if we keep doing that, we are deferring the responsibility of being the citizen of the country only to them, to say run the country for us, make all of these decisions on, and when things don't happen, we all suffer collectively, the businesses and everyone who lives in South Africa. The plans are clear, all the policies are nicely written, the core issues on implementation. ourselves and the organization like AgriSA and the others, the core thing now that they need to be focusing on is to say, how do we really push to ensure that there is collaboration, these social compacting approaches really lead into something fruitful that can be done so that there's a bit of implementation. And that's the drive at which we are looking at, to say collaboration, and towards the implementation. And that's what we are doing. All the knowledge in the plans, if you could read all of these things closely, all of the plans that we list here, APEP, master plans, NDPs, they all of the insights that we need about what's wrong with South Africa, about what to do going forward. But the key role now is to say, how do we collaborate on doing that? And that's the point at which we are sitting at the AgBiz side, to say that collaboration needs to happen. But the core thing at which we need to start off is dealing with the municipalities and the network industries, which is the rail, water, electricity, and the ports. And of course, there's a lot that can be done that we are already doing with the likes of Transnet and the others to achieve that goal. And I think if then all of that is implemented and things begin to go well, Case and your clients and the others begin also to do well, and I think the business gets to be good for everyone, and even for us as the Agricultural Business Chamber, because we want our members to thrive. And thank you so very much.